I'm very excited to be able to introduce one of my colleagues, Karen Fang from the University of Houston. She's an associate professor of English, but she also focuses on cinema studies. She's also a member of the film committee for the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, which has a wide range of different film programming options that they offer. Karen has recently released a book called Arresting Cinema, Surveillance in Hong Kong. Is that the, yeah.
In Hong Kong film.
Surveillance in Hong Kong film, I knew I was missing something. And she is here today to talk about her work, her research, and also kind of how she became interested in learning about and studying about surveillance in Hong Kong. So with that, I will yield the floor to Karen, and let's give her a round of applause.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on Friday afternoon when the rain finally stopped. And I know there's a lot of other things going on today, so I really appreciate that. I do want to tell you a little bit about my book and some other things that I'm doing here on campus for the rest of the day today, and just about film studies in general. But I thought, just given a recent thing that I just saw happen at the door, I might start with a little anecdote about teaching that relates to surveillance. So when and I should also thank Anne and Christine and everyone else who helped bring me here and organize this event. But what was really funny was when I think the students were filing in, Christine caught some student and specifically said, don't, if you're going to eat, you have to stay, to sort of make sure that everybody was participating in the program. And I thought that was a really, it was just a sort of wonderful moment to see as somebody who's also programming events and always trying to get students to come out and sort of like really engage in ideas, at this moment in your lives when you really have all this time to really think about these sort of things and you're surrounded by all these wonderful ideas. And so as Anne mentioned, I work on one of my main research issues is surveillance, the sort of constant monitoring and collecting of information and the way it affects our lives, both good and bad, and the way we think about it, and also the way that it shapes art in particular. But my very first year teaching as a professor at the University of Houston, I was teaching a class on surveillance in cinema, this topic that I've been working on for years, and they had actually given me a 3-hour time slot, which was usually for graduate courses, and unfortunately that was just the time they gave me. So even though they were undergraduate students, we would have to meet for an hour and a half break, or an hour and 15 minutes break, and then come back and meet for another hour and 15 minutes like a graduate seminar does. And I would take attendance in the beginning of the hour, beginning of the class time, and then we'd have our discussion, then we'd break, and then half the students would not come back after the break. And I'd always think, like, this class is about surveillance. Like, why would you not think that I'm not going to notice those of you who don't come back? So, I just thought that was what Christine did a moment ago. It just sort of reminded me of that. And I just thought it was a really great example of, as you're here as students, to sort of think about not only being sort of engaging in the life of the mind, but also just sort of thinking about this as start of your professionalization, right? And that, like, you need to be a little bit strategic about everything that you do, right? Because people are always watching. So as I mentioned, I have this book called Surveillance in Hong Kong Film, and it really talks about Hong Kong cinema, the sort of film tradition of Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, right, and approaches it from a very different lens or perspective than I think most people associate with sort of action martial arts cinema. And so what I argue in the book about Hong Kong film is this idea of surveillance, of constantly watching and collecting information, is actually this sort of organizing motif or trope throughout the cinema. So it accounts for some of its most distinct genres, like the gambling film, which is a distinct tradition within Hong Kong cinema, and also inspires some of its sort of most distinctive visual style. So if you've seen Hong Kong movies, they're quite jumpy and aggressive in a way that's very different from Hollywood movies. And so the freeze frame in particular is very, there's a lot more freeze frames in a Hong Kong movie. So a Hollywood film, if it uses freeze frame, it might use it once at the end of the film or at once in the middle of the film during a climactic moment. If you've seen a John Woo film, like The Killer or Better Tomorrow, or even some of his Hollywood movies like Paycheck, he'll have 6 or 8 freeze frames over the course of the film. And so one of the things I'm arguing is these sort of things that we think about Hong Kong cinema have to do with this culture of surveillance in Hong Kong, which is very very intense. So in Hong Kong, you have to carry your ID card at all times. There are surveillance cameras everywhere. Traffic flow is monitored. So if you go in the subway system, you have to walk in a certain direction. There's actually arrows in the subway that tell you you need to be on this side. And often, if you deviate from that, somebody will come along and tell you to go along. And so there are security guards everywhere. And so I was interested in what might be the relationship between this culture of surveillance in the city itself and the ways in which the cinema looks like. And so my book sort of delves into that, and as a way to understand the cinema that's been so successful. So some of you may or may not know that Hong Kong film is one of the world's most successful cinemas outside of Hollywood. So for many years, it was one of the most prolific cinemas in the world, actually releasing more movies than Hollywood. Only Bollywood, the Hindi film industry, actually was more prolific. It was one of the only regional film industries in the world where local consumption of domestically produced films exceeded that of Hollywood imports. So most everywhere else you go in the world, people are really just watching Hollywood movies. So even if another country has a sort of prolific or critically acclaimed film industry, like in Europe, right, most people are still just watching Hollywood movies. It's only in particular cases, like Bollywood or Nollywood in Nigeria, right, where there are these distinct local film industries where local consumers are watching local product. But again, what distinguishes Hong Kong is Hong Kong was so successful, it really started to shape Hollywood as well. So, Bruce Lee, already in the 70s, was an international movie star. Jackie Chan, internationally famous, right? John Woo relocated to Hong Kong to direct action movies, right? And so here you have a case of what's called a peripheral or marginal cinema shaping the sort of, global industry. So imagine if it would be like if, some really small, actually this relates to one of the films that we're going to talk about, one of the films I'm going to show tonight. Like, if we think of Coca-Cola or McDonald's as being the examples of sort of American cultural imperialism, it would be like the sort of equivalent in a very regional thing starting to transform Coca-Cola or McDonald's, like as if McDonald's started like feeling it ought to sell like Cantonese roast duck because it was so popular. Okay, so I was very interested in Hong Kong cinema for that reason, the ways in which culture can contest the sort of homogenization of the world. So that's sort of what I teach and what my research is. But to step back from that, I think one of the things that I think what's really valuable, and I tell my students this about studying Hong Kong film, is that aside from sort of getting to know this really dynamic industry that for many people is sort of invisible, it's also really good training in just sort of being more global and more multicultural and learning to think outside of what you know, right? It's also really good training in media. Right, and I think that as young people who are going to go out into the global marketplace and the world economy, in a year or 2 years or something, if you understand that the world is diverse, and if you understand the media forms by which the economy happens today, right, like those are the best skills to have, as future workers, right? And so, aside from just sort of learning about the content of Hong Kong films, I think, being an engaged viewer of movies, right, an engaged viewer of movies that are not just Hollywood movies, right? Not only is it sort of aesthetically rewarding, right? It's always pleasurable to see a good movie, but it also makes you, I think, smarter, sophisticated, and ultimately a more creative person.